So today we want to talk a little bit about one of the main principles, maybe the first most relevant principle in creating a program for weightlifting, individual differences. Individual differences, the idea that not everybody can sit, in a gym and do the exact same thing and see the exact same outcome. There have to be differences in volumes, intensity, exercises, all of these other principles really to make sure that everybody's program is optimized. Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit about these individual differences. I guess could you start by just explaining, and we can talk about how this works with the Weightlifting AI app as well, is why is it that you and I can't just do the same thing and see the same results? Why does there have to be a difference?
Yeah, so within the individual differences, as far as like biological things, height, weight, muscle mass, sex, like those things affect the amount of training you can do, mm-hmm. and like the intensity of training you're going to use to get the same result. So, for example, a really large, really heavy person is going to train and recover differently than a really small, light person.
Mm-hmm. They need to do less, like lower average intensity, lower volume,
right?
Because they can almost inflict more damage on themselves per set.
Right, exactly. Yeah. If you're squatting 600 pounds, mm-hmm. one rep of 600 pounds is much more, damaging to you than somebody squatting 300 pounds. Right. And so what that really does is it dictates a lot of what happens in the program, like, how often you can go heavy, how many sessions in a week can be really hard. And it also dictates the total size of sessions and the total amount of volume you're going to do. Mm-hmm. And it's important that we get that right, because if you're doing a training program that's written for me, mm-hmm. It's going to exhaust you significantly faster, or it's going to have just a suboptimal result. Mm-hmm. You're going to be training at volumes that are too low or too high to make progress, mm-hmm. or too low or too high to recover from. Right. Okay. And so it's just less effective.
Yeah. So you mentioned sort of like we have a certain number of overloading training sessions in a week, and then a certain number of sort of technical sessions. So for someone like me, I suppose I was I wasn't weak, but I was much more technically impressive, I suppose, than I was physically impressive. I was going to use you as an example, but I feel like you still moved pretty well, but you were certainly like your excess was in the strength department, particularly in the legs. How might that differ then in terms of how many overloading sessions I'm going to do?
Well, so with overloading sessions versus technique sessions, what we're looking at is, our goal in training weightlifting. There's multiple components. One thing we want to train is strength and power, which are motor qualities. The other thing we want to train is technical skills. And so in order to preserve technical skills and not have technique decay too quickly, mm-hmm. if we want to basically maximize the number of sessions we can do in a given week. So in the app, if you select you're going to train 5 days a week, and we've found through your individual differences that it'd be best for you to overload mm-hmm. one time a week, mm-hmm. have one overloading session a week. Yeah. That leaves us 4 opportunities to stave off technical mm-hmm. decay by having sessions that are below the threshold of significant enough to drive progress and also increase fatigue significantly, but heavy enough and significantly stimulating enough to maintain technical skills.
So are we sort of moving into, am I right in saying that's sort of looking into SRA, where like something like the snatch, we can touch it more frequently because it's doing less damage, and as a skill it decays much quicker than the squat, which we may want to overload once or twice a week, but it's going to last longer.
Yes.
And it's far more fatiguing. You can't do it as frequently, and you can probably get away with it a couple of times because you don't drop off as quickly.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. And individual differences will determine those things, right? It kind of gives us a lay of the land, if you will. Like individual differences really sets the tone for how we actually go about assembling the rest of the principles into a program.
Yeah. Right. So with the Weightlifting AI app, then we collect at the start various pieces of information. There are obviously there's the what are your numbers on all of these different variations of the lift, because we need that to build a better sort of technical understanding of the athlete compared to a model that we want them to reach. But then in terms of Well, what else are we collecting? Because there's age, sex, like
Right.
why? Which of those?
Yeah, so the major individual differences that we're concerned with are biological ones that affect how much loading you can do. So height, sex, weight, strength, and then essentially we're taking those main components and turning them into a, what's the model of what this person can do. It affects how much total volume you're going to do, where your overloading volume landmarks are. So where, minimum effective volume is, where maximum recoverable volume is. And then the other individual differences we're going to collect are essentially, what are your weaknesses?
Right.
Like, what are your technical weaknesses? And that's basically determining exercise selection. So we would look at, okay, Seb just tell me he's 28 years old, 6'2",
6'1",
6'1", 95 kilos.
Yeah, roughly.
Okay.
Yeah, pretty good.
Yeah, and your training age is let's say
8 years in weightlifting.
9 years,
yeah.
right? So that gives us a model as to like, okay, and he's a man, I assume. So
not always, but
that gives us a model as to like, okay, where is he going to fall as far as how big are his sessions? What are his overload sessions going to look like? How many reps is he going to do in a workout? How many of those workouts can he do in a week, right? And where are the boundaries of that? What's the minimum he needs to do to improve, and what's the maximum he can do and recover from and be beneficial to him?
So there's like this scope of possibilities, and by those bits of data that you take from me, it narrows it to know roughly what it's going to start with. How do we then ensure that sort of that width gets even more acutely tuned over time?
Right. So as you train, as you give inputs and you give ratings, those numbers will adjust and will get closer to perfect, right?
So if I say, like, we've got 3 sets of 5 in the back squat, if I'm rating all of them quite poorly, it's dropping me down set by set, that's then going to feed back into the app to say, maybe not one too many overloading sessions, but maybe the first overloading session was too much.
Right. We would, there'd be an adjustment to like your MEV, MRV ranges, so we can say, hey, we thought it was, let's say 15 to 24, but it's actually probably closer to like 12 and 18, right? And that gets us much closer to target. The goal of the program, and something to remember about everything here with the program, is that we want to be in an optimal range. We want to be in a place that's allowing us the convergence of both developing the most motor qualities, like most power, most strength, and the best possible technical outcome. So training sessions should be highly, I guess you call it like perfect as far as technique goes. The most quality technique we can get at the largest amount of training volume, right? So we can maximize both those things. We could always shift one or the other and like give you more volume with more misses, more low ratings, more bad technique, but it's going to train you to be a less good weightlifter.
Right, okay. And then one of the things you mentioned that we collect is height. And I feel like that is the least taken into consideration metric. It's, and I could be wrong here, it's almost like height is a proxy for, and correct me if I'm totally wrong here, height is almost a proxy for femur versus spine.
Well, it's normally, so height is actually really a proxy for weight class. So we can look at, we gather that information, but we also have a comparison to like a qualification chart. So we can look at you and say, okay, Seb is 6'2" and 95 kilos, and his total is let's say 285, right? We know that he's 6'2" and he's underweight because he should probably be a super, right? And his total should probably be 100 kilos higher. So we can look at like what qualification level you are, and we can compare that to other lifters of a similar level. So qualification is interesting because qualification basically allows us, it's kind of like Sinclair. It would allow us to look at you and be like, okay, Seb's a class 3 lifter or a class 1 lifter.
I reached class 1.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
by like the Soviet model.
So you're a class 1 lifter, and we can say how does that compare to other class 1 lifters, and that gives us better information, data to draw from, and say, okay, what are traits of class 1 lifters in training programs that make sense? So like an example would be, lower qualified lifters can train much higher intensity because the absolute weight of the bar is lower. Right. Yeah. And so it gives us a chance to shift the total training load towards that more, a little bit more high intensity lifts. And then, obviously it changes with different classifications. As an example, we want to get that information. We can use that to make, programming decisions.
Right.
One other component that all the individual differences affect, and this is kind of a byproduct of strength level or body weight, is phase length, right? So shorter, lighter female lifter going to recover much faster. The loading and the progression of loading can be much more linear, and with shorter training phases, because recovery is much easier, right? Or happens much faster. With larger lifters that have to scale from smaller numbers to larger numbers, right? Going from a 200 kilo squat to a 300 kilo squat. If you did that over 3 weeks, that's some pretty big jumps, right? So phase length changes as individual differences change, right? So it affects essentially not necessarily the length of a training cycle, because your training cycle could only be 8 weeks if your competition is 8 weeks away, but the length of each phase within that cycle. And it's trying to optimize, the system tries to optimize that for, for the input you can give it, right? As to how old you are and how heavy you are and whatnot.
So it's possible that two people could put that information in and say, I'm going to compete in 10 weeks. And the larger, heavier athlete would, potentially not have any kind of hypertrophy phase, and their taper period would be significantly longer. Whereas the lighter female athlete might be hitting 3 sort of separate mesocycles.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. I'm not sure the terminology that we're going to use in the app, but the fatigue, the fitness level of the athlete going into it, because we are going to take that into account based on if they've just come off a cycle versus I've been dilly-dallying, doing bits and bobs for the last month versus I haven't trained in 3 months.
Yeah. Fitness level isn't necessarily an individual difference as much as a current state.
Yeah.
But we want to look at fitness level as, okay, we don't know where you are coming into the app. So we want to get the best assessment we can. If you're coming in from a complete layoff, versus coming in like, hey, I just crushed it at AO series and I've got, I'm rested for a week and I'm ready to go. We want to start from a different point, right? As to how much do we need to ramp up your work capacity or your general training to get you into shape for actual training.
That makes sense. All right, guys, I hope that that makes sense as to the individual differences that we take into account when generating these programs. Like we said before, if you're interested in learning more about the Weightlifting AI app, there is a link down below in the description or in the comment section where you can get all of the details.